In the town of Diamond, Missouri, September 28, 1906, the Reverend James and Clara Miller had their first child. They would name him Paul. Reverend Miller raised his family with traditional Christian values and an appreciation of the simple things in life. Moving through the rural towns of the American Midwest, preaching the circuit from Missouri to Arkansas, and finally settling in Oklahoma. The family would move at least 7 times while Paul was growing up. A frontiersman in his own right, the Reverend brought up his 6 children hunting and working together to help the family with their daily lives. Their home was modest, but always a place of closeness, warmth, and love.
His father was a Campbellite itinerant Protestant minister, and his mother, former Clara Rand. They were both very highly educated, and they didn't have a lot of money, but they had a very, very close family. And Paul was raised with what we would today call traditional Christian values. They did a lot of very rural or country activities like hunting together and gardening, and it was Paul's job to bring in the firewood. And when he looked back on his upbringing, upon his graduation from high school, he wrote a wonderful poem about how his first 18 years, really, he had no complaints, and that he credited his parents with everything that was good about him. Very, very warm, affectionate, very, very positive family. And I think it carried over into his adult life for the rest of his life.
Paul Miller, the oldest of the 6 children, was tall, handsome, and driven. Frequently called away for business, the Reverend Miller would leave Paul as the head of the household and charge him with caring for his mother and younger siblings. His father wrote often, telling Paul of his travels and giving him guidance.
You can put these on and help Mama. They will be good to wear when you cut kindling and carry in wood. This leaves me well, and I hope you are feeling fine and like to live in Sulphur. School began here yesterday. Take good care of Mama and the girls. You will have to take my place while I am away. Goodbye. Write me a letter, your Papa.
Young Paul would often write poems about his everyday life. Some he would send to his mother.
Or was it 2? I sat idly by and dreamed of you, old husky land. I visioned days far gone when by your
As a boy, he showed a predisposition to writing by exhibiting traces of wit, charm, and tongue-in-cheek humor that would later make his newspaper columns and editorials so interesting and readable. As an avid sportsman, Paul was exceptional at basketball and football. When 13 years old, Paul began to write about one of his passions. As his first experience in publishing, Paul created the first volume of The Boy Sportsman in August of 1920. Shortly after, he published The Boy Athlete, Every Boy's Magazine. On the cover, he proudly printed Paul Miller, editor, Quapaw, Oklahoma. In writing about his world, Paul had found his passion. His time in high school and through college was consumed with newspapering, and through hard work, perseverance, and the numerous professional connections he made at that time, Paul would earn himself a spot with the Associated Press. One busy afternoon in the press room, Paul would meet the woman who would become the love of his life. Through a partition, Paul saw Louise Johnson, a writer for the Ohio State Journal. Paul, the man who had spent his youth writing poetry, left a simple note on Louise's typewriter asking, "What can a lonely newspaperman do in Columbus on his night off?" Louise matched Paul's note with one of her own. She simply replied, "You could take me out tonight." Shortly after their first date, the newspaper couple would be married. The couple would have 4 children starting in 1934. Their first, Rand Miller, was born in New York. The birth of their only daughter, Jean, was followed by Paul Jr. and Kemper.
He loved his work, and they always read newspapers at night. And he'd bring home newspapers, and after dinner they'd sit together and read newspapers. And that went on in Washington and Rochester. I remember that very well, that she would read everything. They'd go, start from the beginning of the paper, and I know they had the New York Times in Rochester, and so they read that along with the local newspapers, and Dad was very strict about us going to church. And being a minister's son, I think that made him feel that it was the right thing to do for our family. So whether we wanted to go or not, even as teenagers, when we were older, we went to church. And so I'd say we had a pretty normal family life.
Paul continued his career with the Associated Press for more than a decade, climbing through the ranks with impressive speed. Initially hired as a rewrite man in 1932, he would leave the Associated Press as assistant general manager in 1947 with the prospect of a promising career with Gannett. Handpicked by Frank Gannett, Paul served as his right-hand man and executive assistant at the Gannett Company, located in Rochester, New York. Paul was no stranger to hard work, taking on additional duties as editor and publisher of the Rochester Time-Union and publisher of the Democrat and Chronicle. Under Paul's direction, the Gannett Company would thrive and gain circulation well past his retirement in 1977. Over a year after departing from Gannett, Paul suffered a stroke, leaving him with limited movement on the right side of his body. He and his wife would live in West Palm Beach, Florida, until Paul's death in 1991 by cardiac arrest at the age of 84. From a very young age, Paul started writing. Whether it was poetry for his mother or letters to his father, he was a natural wordsmith. During high school, he took a position as editor with the WWII, the Pawhuska High School newspaper in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. Paul's time spent at his high school newspaper would not go unnoticed. Impressed with Paul's editorship, innovation, and creativity, the editor of the Daily Okollegian, the campus newspaper at Oklahoma Agricultural and Mechanical College, now Oklahoma State University, sent a letter asking Paul to attend a banquet at the college. C. Walker Stone wrote to Paul saying, "Under the auspices of the College Press Club, I have been authorized to invite 12 male editors of high school newspapers to the Gridiron Banquet."
Walker invited Paul, along with 11 other male high school editors, to a Gridiron Banquet, which Paul attended, and they hit it off immediately. Stone invited Paul to join the Kappa Sigma fraternity, which he did, and enrolled in Oklahoma A&M that fall. And their friendship endured for decades. Mr. Stone met Paul's parents, who just adored him. In 1972, both of them, in the same ceremony, were awarded the Henry G. Bennett Distinguished Service Award at Oklahoma State University. So they're just a lifelong friendship. Of course, Walker Stone became the editor of the Scripps-Howard newspapers, and so he as well as Miller both had very, very successful newspaper careers.
From the time Paul arrived at Oklahoma A&M, he threw himself into being an active member of the campus community. He ran a successful campaign and was elected president of the freshman class. At the Daily Okollegian, he worked as the assistant sports editor, acting manager, and was later promoted to managing editor of the paper. Despite being such a key figure at the college paper, Paul struggled with paying for school and would often write home of his financial challenges.
More concussion than I had anticipated. As a result, I am more or less wrought up and really feel like telephoning, but the skeletonized condition of my wallet prohibits that little dabble in extravagance. I mean, by all the preliminary, that I have received a phone call from the manager of the Daily Oklahoman this afternoon offered me a job.
Paul was just a very ambitious college student. He hit the ground running, as he did for the remainder of his adult life. In addition to being an assistant sports editor for the Okollie, he became first acting managing editor and then the managing editor. But to pick the permanent managing editor, they had to face a campus-wide election. Paul ran against his erstwhile colleague, Otis Wiley, and lost, unfortunately, by 24 votes out of 1,774 cast. It was the largest number of votes for any office on campus. The election was critical for him to remain in school, and when he lost the election, he was forced to drop out at the end of his sophomore year.
His choice was clear. He would take a position with the Okemah Publishing Company in 1927 to make ends meet. Paul would spend a little over a year working at the Okemah Daily and then move on to become a staff correspondent for both the Daily Oklahoman and the Oklahoma City Times. Now on his feet financially, he would find himself returning to Oklahoma A&M to write for the Stillwater News Press and complete his degree in 1932. Even before completion of his degree, his talent was noticed by some significant names in the newspaper industry. Leon Durst, Oklahoma City Associated Press bureau chief, was quoted saying, "Here is a man the Associated Press should have."
I think from the start, when he worked on a newspaper as a student, that was what he always wanted to do.
At only 25 years old, Paul was offered a position that would propel his career to the Associated Press offices in Columbus, Ohio. On March 1, 1932, Paul received his first assignment for the Associated Press. As a personal goal, Paul set out to meet 2 new people every day and would often use the game of golf to network. Paul would climb through the ranks of the Associated Press, thrusting him into the newspaper limelight. At the height of the Second World War, Paul became the AP's Washington bureau chief and the assistant general manager for the news service. Throughout this tumultuous time, his bipartisan approach to journalism allowed him to bring the thoughts and viewpoints of foreign leaders, national heroes, and VIPs to the American public. In his travels, Paul would meet Frank Gannett in Washington. Frank, a conservative Republican, made a name for himself in the newspaper industry. Frank noticed Paul almost immediately with his connections, charisma, and swift rise to success. On August 1, 1947, Gannett would make him an offer to join him at the Gannett Company. It was plain to see that he was being groomed. Frank was in his 70s and looking for someone he could trust to succeed him. 2 years into the new position, Paul was named editor and publisher of the Rochester, New York Times-Union and vice president and director of the Gannett Company. He later was elected to the board of directors of the Gannett Foundation, appointed operating head of the company, and on April 12, 1957, Paul Miller would succeed Frank Gannett as president. Paul retired on December 31, 1978, from the newspaper business after serving 31 years expanding and shaping the Gannett Company. He became chairman of the board and was put in charge of acquisitions. Paul was never very far from the career he loved.
Paul Miller made history as a newspaperman in his own chosen field. But as far as these broad political and military events, beginning in 1942 and ending with his retirement in 1979, he didn't make history, but he met so many of the people who did make this history, from world leaders on both sides of the Iron Curtain, the American presidents, the leaders of European countries and South American countries, the communist leaders, Khrushchev and Zhou Enlai, to name 2. He witnessed this, and he was able to communicate what he witnessed through his newspapers, through the Gannett chain, to millions of readers in the United States.
Paul's early work had set him on a path to meet some of the most influential people of his time. In June of 1942, Miller's career brought him to Washington, D.C. There, he found himself bureau chief of the AP in the nation's capital at the height of the greatest global conflict the world had seen. During the war, Miller never served as a foreign correspondent. As the conflict came to a close, access to air transportation grew, and Miller's knack for being in the right place at the right time reached a new level. Paul's first overseas trip was in 1945, immediately following the Japanese surrender. He was one of 3 journalists invited on board the inaugural trip of the Globester. Pan Am's first round-the-world route. The week-long trip covered over 23,000 miles. Paul and the other reporters provided dispatches at each stop along the way.
I think it began to occur to him how important it was for a man in his position to understand the world and to be familiar with more than just the United States. So I think that was one of his primary motivations. Also, he just loved traveling. He just loved traveling.
The nature of his position and the extent of his mobility provided Paul with access to leaders, trendsetters, and celebrities around the world. His charm and open nature led these insiders to share amazing stories and insights, even befriending Paul. Many of these stories made their way into Paul's reporting. Others he kept in his private papers, now housed in the Oklahoma State University archives. Presidents, high-ranking military personnel, and ambassadors were among those who chose to confide in Paul.
Almost all of these briefings were off the record. They would speak about things that were not for public dissemination yet, but they wanted these high-placed newspaper people to understand what the United States government was doing both militarily and politically during the war.
Paul recognized the significance of these confidential briefings, and he began to document these meetings, forwarding memoranda to Kent Cooper in New York City. Topics documented in these confidential files were diverse and high impact. The briefers discussed battle fatigue, now known as PTSD, the selection of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as bomb sites, and the beginning of the Cold War. Often other reporters who received similar briefings would send their own confidential memoranda to Paul. He kept these, filing them away for future reference, waiting for the time when he was allowed to finally print them and attribute the source. A very patriotic American, Paul never published anything he wasn't allowed to by any of these briefers. Paul was truly a witness to history. Throughout his 30-plus years as a Cold War journalist, he observed and participated in many of the world's most dramatic and impactful events. His international interviews read like a who's who of the time. 1949. In the wake of the Berlin airlift, Paul travels to Berlin in a military transport filled with coal for the Berlin residents, reporting back with his first-hand accounts. 1950. Paul takes his first trip to South America, where he meets with Juan and Eva Perón. 1951. Paul returns to Europe to interview Dwight Eisenhower, following up on a rumor that Eisenhower planned to run for president. 1954. The CIA installs strongman Carlos Castillo Amas in Guatemala. Paul makes a point to meet the man in person, determined to learn more about this new reactionary regime. 1956. Paul takes what is perhaps his most important trip to date. He travels to London, where he speaks with Sir Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister. The two discuss the Suez Crisis. Eden lays out Britain and France's case for occupation. Paul fact-checks the conversation by flying to Cairo to survey the situation for himself. To the surprise of many, he reports back that the Egyptians were operating the canal as efficiently as the British and French had. 1960. Before Cuba was closed to Americans, Paul visited Havana on a fact-finding mission. 1962. Following a White House dinner with friend John F. Kennedy, Paul flies to Russia, where he interviews Nikita Khrushchev. Upon his return, Paul shares his impressions with the president. 1965. He returns to England to attend the funeral of friend Winston Churchill. 1972. With his good friend Richard Nixon, Paul and his wife travel to China. There they meet with the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. During the same trip, Paul establishes, for the first time in 22 years, regular news exchanges with the Chinese news agency Xinhua. Paul certainly was not blind to the oppressive actions of individuals like the Perons, Armas, and Khrushchev, but he was able to balance an issue and not see it through the lens of his political ideology. Paul was able to share personal observations and put them into words that his readers back in the States could relate to. Paul's approach and open-mindedness gave a human face to public figures who were more often painted in only an unflattering light.
I don't think no, I think he tried to be bipartisan because I think you feel more relaxed if you don't talk about what you're, how you feel about it. I think being a good reporter is really to interview somebody and get what you can out of that person and not give your views so much.
So he didn't let his personal political philosophy interfere with his reporting or journalism?
No, I don't think he showed that he was biased. If he thought that if he was biased, he didn't let people know that. Famous people didn't know.
He used the newspapers for good. To him, it was an instrument for improving lives, not only locally, but he was probably one of the first men or women to look at the world as a global community. He probably developed this idea going all the way back to 1945 when he had taken his first round-the-world trip. And from that point on, he took great pleasure in educating Americans about what was outside the borders of this country. But at the same time, he could also be very, very devoted to a very small, relatively speaking, issue in Rochester, New York.